Hello, video viewers. My name is Kristi Daeda, and I'm the president of the Family Business Consulting Group. I'm here with my colleague, David Lansky. Hi, David.
Hello, Kristi.
David is a longtime consultant to wealthy and business-owning families, and in his work has guided families through growth, repairing difficult relationships, and turning stagnant or struggling enterprises into thriving organizations. His work with families is informed by over 15 years as a managing partner in a clinical psychology practice, before focusing his efforts as a consultant to family enterprise. He's also written a book about the ways that family factors support success or struggle in living out their business and wealth continuity plans. The book is called Family Wealth Continuity: Building a Foundation for the Future. Today, we're going to talk about a pattern that David has observed of particular interest to family offices, wealth managers, and others who are advising families as they plan for their shared future, which he calls Latent Development Syndrome. David, what is latent development syndrome, and why is it a problem for wealthy families?
Well, Kristi, we view latent development syndrome as occurring when family members who are served by a family office demonstrate limited age-appropriate growth and development as wealth owners and beneficiaries. Some of the accompaniments of the syndrome include a lack of significant engagement with the family office. So, for example, there are few meaningful roles that family members can play in the family office, or family members may experience some uncertainty as to whether or when they have a say in how the family office operates or in the goals of the family office. Another element of latent development syndrome is one of the things you often see is financial literacy. So family members may not understand key financial, investment, or estate planning concepts, even though these are central to their relationship with the family office and central to the role that the family office plays in the life of the family. There are often, with latent development syndrome, there are often weak or non-existent relationships between members of the rising generation and family office executives, trustees, and key advisors. As what I think is a good example of latent development syndrome and kind of how it's perceived within a family office, I was recently contacted by the CEO of a family office who was concerned about the third generation family members. And so we were on a call, and I said, so what's the problem? And she said, well, the third generation are spending well beyond their means. I said, okay, I can understand that's a challenge. How can I be of assistance? I said. So she said, well, we'd like you to talk to them. And I said, well, okay, so how have you addressed this previously? And she said, well, we've talked to them. I said, okay, so do these family members have any role in the family office at all, or in the operating company, or in any way managing or having input as to the family wealth, family philanthropy, or any of those elements of the services that you provide? And she said, well, no. And so I said, well, so their only role is as consumers? And she said, well, yes. And I said, okay, so they're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing, which is acting as consumers. So basically, look, the idea here is that the family office was concerned about the fact that third generation family members were acting only as consumers, but there were really no legitimate other means for them to be engaged with the family office, and lecturing will not help. So I think that's a good example of how latent development syndrome can manifest itself.
Perfect, thank you. You know, much of our audience for this discussion will be professionals that are serving families of wealth, working in wealth management, family offices, multifamily offices, similar kinds of practices. What experiences are these professionals likely to have in their careers that make this discussion important for them?
So that's a great question. And look, the fact is that if a majority of family members don't somehow buy into the mission of the family office, or if they don't care, if they're not interested, if they don't participate, if they don't know how to participate in the mission or strategy of the family office, then the family and the family office face a number of risks. And some of those risks include passive beneficiaries who lack the skills to properly manage the gifts that they have been provided. And of course, this is a challenge because eventually they're going to have much more control than they have at present. Another risk is having beneficiaries who have little connection to the values that accompanied wealth creation in the first place, and that actually serve as a foundation for wealth preservation and for the very purpose of setting up the family office. Sometimes latent development syndrome can lead to dissension and conflict in the family because there's either uncertainty or a lack of understanding as to what purpose there is for the wealth preservation structures or the family office itself. And in my view, family disunity and dissension pose some of the greatest risks to sustaining family wealth and the family office, at least over the short term. And the fact is that all families face risks to cohesiveness due to increasing numbers, due to increasingly diverse backgrounds of family members, married-in family members, and there's over time a progressive dilution of the affinities that actually bring families together. So, there's a saying, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. My friend and colleague Jay Hughes has said, entropy to entropy in 3 generations, meaning that family organizations tend toward disorganization over time. And without good engagement by rising generation family members, that disorganization can accelerate or will accelerate over time. And I'm guessing that most family office executives and family members, once we're discussing this syndrome, that most family office executives and family members either have seen it themselves or know someone who has seen it themselves. And latent development syndrome is a risk factor for disunity because family members who don't experience, and here, one of the important points is age-appropriate development. Family members who don't experience age-appropriate development are unlikely to be good stewards of a family's wealth and a family's wealth continuity structures, such as the family office. They may not be able to assume appropriate responsibility or thoughtful responsibility when required. And as I said before, they lack connection to the values that led to wealth creation in the first place. They may, because of this, undermine continuity plans, which that in turn can threaten family cohesion. And of course, on the other hand, this is possible, on the other hand, managing latent development syndrome well will help to mitigate the risks posed by the syndrome.
Thank you, David. I think that idea of entropy to entropy captures things well, because the family office is often founded to counteract that, to create this sort of communal experience, to keep families together, to help them to leverage that familyness, which I know is a topic that's important to you. So you've written an article that outlines some of the signs to look out for, and we'll share how people can reach that article at the end of the video. But can you share a couple of the signs with us, and what do you think that advisors and family office leaders are likely to see happening in the family that would give you an idea that this latent development syndrome is occurring?
Okay, so that's a good question. As I said before, one key indicator is having basically passive beneficiaries who lack the skills to properly make decisions regarding their financial gifts, and who haven't properly been oriented or educated as to the nature of the family's assets. People who experience the latent development syndrome tend to be viewed by others within the family office as immature or uninterested, and they're treated accordingly. Such treatment can be described as infantilizing. And of course, this infantilizing treatment actually leads to a vicious cycle where, on the one hand, if someone is viewed as not being able to take responsibility, they're probably not given responsibility. And if they're not given responsibility, then they tend not to learn responsibility. One of the things I say to, often say to clients is that in order to take responsibility, there needs to be something to take responsibility for. I have a colleague who is a CEO of a significant family office who, in remarking on family members who have become these kind of passive beneficiaries and suffer this latent development syndrome, one of the things he said is that people who are experience that kind of development or lack of development, he said, well, they become very good at one thing. I said, well, what's that one thing they become very good at? And he said, well, they become very good at learning how to ask for money. And that's not it's not a sign of someone who's going to be a great steward of the family's assets. So another element of the latent development syndrome in the family office is you would see lots of top-down control in the family office. So, for example, in one family that I work with, every request for withdrawal from a newly created trust had to be okayed by the patriarch, even though that was actually contrary to the trust's provisions. And even though each time a request for some kind of distribution was made, the patriarch would become angry and upset, demonstrating another element of this kind of latent development syndrome culture, and that is ambivalence about the gifts that have been provided to family members. So it's not unusual for wealth creators to make significant gifts to their children and grandchildren, because of course, one of the goals is to preserve wealth for generations. And yet at the same time, people often feel ambivalent about those gifts. And it's not unusual for there to be some kind of tension around the family members actually using the gifts that they've been provided. So, as I said, so in this one family, an example of latent development syndrome was the patriarch having to be involved in every request for distribution. In another family, again, as an example of this kind of significant top-down control, in another family, the CEO of the family office was threatened with termination if he didn't reveal to the patriarch confidential information about his grandchildren. And so I think you can see that in both of these situations, the degree of top-down control can certainly interfere with or undermine the development of responsible wealth owners in the family. And so anyhow, so these are some of the elements that you would observe in family office where there's a latent development syndrome.
That's really helpful. I think the examples that you shared around top-down control particularly, highlights how the operation of the family office, possibly driven by these entrepreneurial founders, can help to create this challenge. So when you see these behaviors emerging in families, what role do you find that the family office often has in unintentionally creating this problem? And what role can it have in addressing some of these unmet needs and turning things around?
Okay, so I think a key word that you just used is unintentional. In my view, a lot of what we see with latent development syndrome is kind of unintended consequence. And it's kind of paradoxically, it's an unintended consequence of the family office doing exactly what the family office is supposed to do, which is taking care of its clients. So like parenting generally, too much of a good thing can do more harm than good. Too much parenting can lead to enabling and dependency on the part of the next generation. Most people don't want to see that. They don't want to see family members who are dependent and who haven't been able to be launched in the world in productive ways. So it's really, so one of the things that is really important is there, as I mentioned before, there being something for people to take responsibility for without that, and without kind of almost like being part of the mission of the family office, part of the strategy of the family office to develop responsible wealth owners in the next generation. Without that, you have this vicious cycle of enabling, leading to dependency, leading to more enabling, and leading to more dependency. And again, what I want to emphasize is that this is an unintended consequence of the family office doing exactly what the family office is intended to do.
So what would you say are a few specific actions that advisors and wealth professionals who are observing these kinds of dynamics can do to help a family address these challenges?
So as I mentioned before, incorporating strategically in the mission of the family office, the idea that our role is not only to serve our family clients, but also to help them develop as responsible owners of wealth, to really embrace that as part of the mission. I like to think of that as active engagement. So really truly understanding what kinds of roles are available to family members and having honest dialogue about the types of roles that family members can serve in and what kind of experiences, skills, interests, talents, and so on would be required for family members to serve in those roles. I think a useful tactic for family offices to counter the latent development syndrome is to consider benchmarks for progressively increasing levels of responsibility and to be very clear and to articulate what those benchmarks are. So, for example, what specific roles are available? Is it possible to be an observer on the board? Is it possible to actually serve as a director? Is it possible to sit on an investment committee? And specifically, what types of experiences and qualities and, of course, skills would be necessary for people to serve in those roles? That gives people an idea about the kind of development path that would be helpful to enhance the likelihood that family members are going to be responsible owners of wealth. Another task that I think is very important for the families and family offices to consider is how to have honest dialogue about money itself. Talking about money is difficult for every family. But in families with a family office, money is kind of a central organizing factor in the family. And if you don't have these honest, open discussions about what are the values that should guide us as owners of wealth, what are our goals and what is the purpose of the wealth that has been created, in addition to specifically understanding what are the assets that the family owns, these are all elements of enhancing the maturity and the level of responsibility that family members can take. As I said before, I think really thinking about the family office, that the role is not just to take care of family members, but to help them develop as responsible owners of wealth. Another step that families and family office can take is to really advance an understanding of the difference between ownership and management when it comes to a family's financial assets. The fact is that most family members will not be able to serve in a role of actively managing the family's wealth. That's, professional experience and training is required for that. And there are probably limited roles available in the family office, and probably more family members who could be interested in serving in some of those roles than that there are roles available. But family members can be developed as owners of wealth rather than as managers of the family's wealth. And so what does that mean? It means being able to provide input on matters such as how a family's values may affect investment strategy, how the family's values or mission can affect a family's philanthropy, and providing input as well as to what are the liquidity needs of family members. All of these are ownership functions rather than management functions, and understanding that there's a difference and that indeed there are significant roles that family members can play as owners as opposed to managers of wealth is another element of development, age-appropriate development of family members. And finally, one of the things I would say is that look, time and patience are really important allies in helping to manage the latent development syndrome. What I've seen in families that I've worked with over time is that when the family office does embrace the strategy of development of family members and sees that, and the family sees that part of the mission of the family office is to help family members become responsible owners of wealth and to be actively engaged with the family office, over time, family members who at one point you might have been viewed as less responsible, that they do assume responsibility. And as I said, time and patience are really important allies.
That's great, David. I think my takeaways from this last very valuable portion of the discussion, I like the reframing of the role of the family office in developing these engaged stewards of the family's enterprise for the next generation. And particularly that point about time. If you're in a position to influence a family and you can look forward into 10 or 15 years in the future and think about how you want people to be engaged at that time, there are things you can do now to work to have time on your side. I think that's a wonderful takeaway. Yeah. So I'm going to throw up on the screen a link to the article for those who would like to read more, as well as contact information for David if you'd like to get in touch with him. Thank you again, David, for sharing your experiences and some ideas for advisors to better serve families.
Thank you, Kristi.
And thank you all for watching this video.